This is technically this year's Halloween and or Samhain special by virtue of being posted right before Halloween, but the story I'm going to tell today actually isn't spooky at all, so clearly I didn't think this through. I told you in my last video that I was going to tell you the story of Táin Regamain, because last time I did Táin Regamain, and they are two stories with very similar titles that both belong to the Ulster cycle but are very different texts. So that's what we're going to do. We are going to explore Táin Regamain. The title means the raid of Regamon's cattle, and unlike some other Táins, this one very much is a cattle raid. It's found in fairly late manuscripts, with the earliest of them being the Yellow Book of Lecan, so that's late 14th, early 15th century. But the text itself is late Old Irish, so we're looking at 800, 900 AD, according to those more learned than I in any case. And despite being one of the Rev Scalar or foretales to the Táin, this one isn't actually a particularly popular story, unlike Táin Regamain, which has the Regamon in it and people tend to get more excited when the other world is involved. But that's good. I like telling the less popular stories on this channel because it means you get to impress people with your knowledge of Old Irish literature and not just have the generic stories that are in every collection of retellings. That also means there hasn't been too much written about the text, so I don't have too many articles to direct you to. The edition I'm using is Danielle Malek's 2002 PhD thesis, which is helpfully on Celt, the corpus of electronic texts, so there is a link to that in the description. Now this is a story about the seven Manias, the seven sons of Ailill and Medb. Side note on pronunciation, I say Mania, some people say Manna, it's spelt Maine, like the place. I think there's some dialectal variations, whether you go for Manna or Mania or whatever. In any case, if you object to my pronunciation, don't at me about it. I'm sure we'll cope. So I started looking at this story when I was working on an article about the seven Manias and how they got their names, and that has now been published in Cambrian Medieval Celtic Studies, which looks like this, and I'll put a link to where you can get that in the description. There are a couple of paragraphs in the article that deal with this particular story, so for the first time ever on this channel, I am telling a story from the point of view of an academic who has published on said story, which is kind of wild. Makes me feel like a professional. Having said that, it wasn't my main focus, so part of the reason I'm making this video is so I could get to know the story better. Once upon a time, there was a famous warrior among the Connachta, whose name was Regamain. He had many herds of cattle, and they were all pretty great, and he had 7 daughters, the 3 Dunana and the 4 Medb. Why they don't have names of their own, I don't know, but considering all of the dudes in this story are called Mania, I guess that is just how we are doing this. And this is the story of how they fell in love with and ran away with the 7 sons of Ailill and Medb: Mania Morgar, Mania Mingar, Mania Athramoil, Mania Maithramoil, Mania Milbel, Mania Anai, Mania Moepart, and Mania Condagavula. Side note, if any of you kept count during that list, and I didn't expect you to, you will notice there were in fact 8 Manias in this list. This happens all the time. In fact, my working title for my article before I came up with the real title was The 6 to 8 Assorted Manias, because they never, almost never when they show up and the text says, yes, the 7 Manias, are there actually 7 of them? It's distressing. That's largely what my article is about. But I guess 6 to 8 Assorted Manias was not as catchy as a group name. So basically this story is supposed to overlap with the early parts of the Táin. Ailill, Medb and Fergus are organising the men of Ireland to raid Ulster in order to nick all of their cows, including the Don Cúlinge, the magnificent bull that started all of this. They have, at my reckoning, around 50,000 fighters in their army, which is a lot of people to be maintaining, especially as they're on the move, not camped in a specific location. As a result, they need food. So Ailill and Medb and Fergus turn to each other, and Ailill says, let's send a messenger to Regamain and see if he can spare us any cows, because we'll never keep the army fed otherwise. They decide to send the 7 Manias on the basis that Regamain's 7 daughters are hot, and therefore that might give them an in. Seduction as a method of stealing cows. So they call for the Manias, and Ailill tells them what they have to do. Medb is very pleased that they're going, and at the filial duty that encourages them to do what they're told. Indeed, says Mania Morgar, it will be going for the sake of duty. Now, the name Morgar essentially means greatly dutiful, and the pun here on the word gore or gar, meaning duty, is probably why he's such a prominent figure in this particular story, despite not appearing too often elsewhere. Either that, or he is named for this story. Like, it's one of the thing of, is he called Mania the Dutiful because this is a story about duty, or is he the protagonist of this story about duty because he's called Mania the Dutiful? Who knows? Mania Mingar, his brother, whose name either means less dutiful or perhaps gently dutiful, is less convinced than his brother by this expedition. Inadequate is our valour, he says. This is as dangerous as going out into the country against enemies. Our upbringing was too soft and we weren't allowed to learn to fight, but you would send us against deadly enemies. Again, just gonna pause here because this is fascinating, because when we meet the Manyas in the Táin, we are explicitly told that they're warriors. When they show up in other texts like Táin, they are explicitly described as warriors. They lead groups of armed warriors and engage in single combat themselves. And here in this text, one of the only stories where they are the main characters, Maine Mingar insists that they weren't taught to fight. And the other reason that's baffling is because the whole reason that all of Ailill and Medb's sons have the same name, and perhaps this is a story I should tell in some other video, but it's very short, is that Medb heard a prophecy that of all of her children it would be Maine who killed Conchobar. So she renamed all of them. Then it turned out to be a different Conchobar he killed, because prophecies be like that. So if she's hoping that her sons are gonna kill Conchobar, it seems distinctly against her own interests to prevent them from learning to fight and becoming competent enough to do that. But that is definitely what this text says, that they were not allowed to fight, that they had a soft, princely upbringing. Anyway, they bid farewell to Ailill and Medb and set off, each with 20 warriors. So there are 7 score of them on this expedition. Or 8, but it says 7. We're just gonna have to trust the text when it tells us there are 7, even though we've counted 8, because otherwise the maths gets very confusing, because the text cannot count. They go south until they're near the border of Cork Madurth, in southern Connacht, and Maine Morgar says, let's send a small number of us to investigate the fort and see whether the girls are open to persuasion, wink wink nudge nudge. Probably. So Maine Mingar goes with 2 others and he runs into 3 of the girls at the spring. Obviously his default action is to threaten them with swords because this man doesn't know how to talk to girls. And they beg for mercy and he says he'll spare them if they meet his demands. Whatever you want, they say, you can have it, except for food supplies, because we can't give you those. Unfortunate, says Maine, since that is exactly what we came here for. They ask who he is and why he's there, and he tells them that he's Maine Mingar, son of Ailill and Medb, and that he's come to their territory to take cows and women. Love the grouping there, treating women like cows as property. Classic misogynistic tale here. But the girls, who, remember, are all in love with the sons of Ailill and Medb, are very excited to hear that this is the Maine that they have been lusting over from a distance. He is the boy band hero of their time. And they are very excited. They're like, great! You know, they don't object to being abducted. They think it's perfectly reasonable for the Manyas to come to nick their cows and carry them off, and they say if it was up to them, they'd go with him in a heartbeat. However, they're worried that if word gets out, their father's warriors will be mad about it, and they are deadly fighters, so it won't end well. They tell the Manyas they'll offer what help they can, and they go to consult the rest of their sisters. So they go to their other sisters, and they're like, hey, you know how you've had a crush on the Manyas this whole time? So they just showed up to abduct us. How are we feeling about this? And the other girls are like, sounds great, love to get abducted by the Manyas, but unfortunately they're probably gonna have to fight their way out of here, and I don't think that's gonna be very fun for any of us. The original girls are like, that is exactly what we thought. It's almost like we're sisters. Anyway, come with me, let's talk to the Manyas, see how we're gonna get out of this. So they all come in a group to the spring where Maine Mingar is still waiting for them. Come with me, he says, and bring your cattle with you and we will protect you from any consequences. Nobody's gonna be dishonoured by this. So the girls muster their cows and their sheep and their pigs secretly so that nobody knows what they're doing. Then they rendezvous with the Manyas. But 7 score warriors and 7 girls and all of their cows and their pigs and their sheep creates quite a crowd, and it is not going to be very surreptitious if they all travel together. So Maine Morgar, who is the leader here, splits the group into 2 and arranges for them to take different paths and meet up with each other at Athbrun. All of this was only possible because Regamain was away for the day. He is down in the territory of Cork-a-Baskin, which is in southern County Clare, so northern Munster, and he is at a meeting with the Fir Bolg. Now, I consulted my friend Rachel about this because the main place the Fir Bolg turn up in medieval literature is Lower Gorala Éireann, the book of the invasions, the book of the takings of Ireland, as the group who invaded Ireland before the Tuatha De Danann came along defeated them before humans came along and drove out the Tuatha De Danann. So it seemed very weird to me that they could be hanging out in Ulster Cycle era Ireland just like talking to people. But Rachel pointed me towards a detail in Lower Gorala that I had never noticed before, where the Fir Bolg make a deal with Medb and Ailill for land and are later defeated by Cuchulainn, Conall and the Ullad. Weird! So I didn't know that. And that is a lesson to all of us, that when you find something weird in a text, You go to the friend who is working on that kind of thing and you say, please tell me what's happening, because you will get there much faster than trying to figure it out yourself. So thank you for that one, Rachel. So yeah, Regamain is talking to the Firbolg and in northern Munster, but we are in southern Connacht, so that is very nearby for those unfamiliar with Irish geography. And as such, when Regamain gets word that his daughters have all run off with the Manyas, or the Manyas have run off with his daughters, depending on your perspective, he's not thrilled about it and he pursues them, which doesn't go great for the Manyas, let's put it like that. Okay, huddle round, says Manu Morga. Somebody needs to go ahead with the cows to drive them home to Cruchu and send a messenger to Medb and Ailill and tell them what is happening to us here. Tell them we're being attacked. So the girls go ahead with the message and the cows and they explain to Medb and Ailill what's happening and ask them to send warriors to help the Manyas. Because of course, Manya Mingar told us at the beginning of the story that they are not fighters themselves, even if they supposedly have 70 warriors with them, so should be reasonably protected. So they seriously need some backup before Regamain kills all of them. Ailill and Medb and Fergus gather together the men of Connacht and the Ulster exiles who are with Fergus, and they ride out to Athbrun to help the Manyas. The Manyas might not be fighters, but they are not totally useless. They've been making wooden hurdles to block the ford so that Regamain and his fighters can't cross the river, buying themselves time until Ailill can arrive with reinforcements. Notably, it is Ailill who is named here as being the leader of the party rather than Medb or Fergus. This is a fairly dude-centric story, and it's also a fairly Connacht-centric story, so that's probably why Ailill is taking the lead. So they meet there with all of their forces, which is probably a polite way of saying they bash each other half to death. But eventually they make peace between them because of the fine boys who had driven the cattle and because of the beautiful girls who had gone with them. In other words, for the sake of our kids, let us not kill each other here today. They give most of the cows back to Regamain because they never intended to nick all of them. But his daughters stay with the Manyas and 70 milk cows stay with them both as a dowry and to help keep the men of Ireland alive during the Táin. And that, we are told, is Táin Regamain, and it is a rev scale to the Táin itself. So that was a very different story to Táin Regamain. Less weird, less excitingly otherworldly, definitely less suited to being my Halloween video, but it is also a rev scale to the Táin despite having those wildly different vibes. I think it's weird how that happens, but it's also fascinating because these texts are all interconnected and part of a big, complex narrative weave, and at the same time they can have nothing to do with each other on an individual like macro level. If you want to know more about the 7 Manyas and their various appearances, I highly recommend picking up my CMCS article, because as far as I know I am the only person who has written about them recently. In the meantime, I will leave you with that story and see you soon for something completely different. Links to everything are as usual in the description. Please consider dropping a few quid in my tip jar if you find my videos helpful and or entertaining. And if you want to buy my YA thriller, The Butterfly Assassin, it's available now in English and in French. French one's a new one, I don't have a copy yet, but I'm very much looking forward to showing it to you when I do. So do be checking those out. Links below. And remember, bring some spare clothes along with you if you're rescuing your lover from the Fairy Queen this Halloween, because after he's done being transformed into stuff, he will be naked and he will be cold. See you soon.